Just before I start, I'll just say that I did my PhD at UQ, and what I tried to do was look at different ways coincidences could be categorized. And I came up with 4, of which synchronicity is 1. And the other 3 would be random chance, hidden causality, second one, and the two types of causality, normal causality and also paranormal causality, and synchronicity, which I would put into a different category from the paranormal, but not all paranormal people would agree with that. So that's fine. But I want to look today, this is basically my first chapter, and it's how Jung came up with the idea of synchronicity. And so composition here has a couple of meanings. Firstly, how Jung conceived and developed, we could say composed, the idea of synchronicity, starting in the 1920s, and how his thinking changed over that time. And secondly, what are the essential elements that go to make up synchronicity, or what is it composed of? Answers to both these are a little bit involved, so we'll take it slowly. Also, I think it's important to point out that for Jung, the whole notion of synchronicity was very much a working hypothesis, and he was not fixed in his thinking about it. So this is a photo of Jung in which his gaze is particularly penetrating. He was born in 1875 and died in 1962 at the age of 85. He's particularly famous for his early association with Freud, and of course there's a lot of material about him on the web. Now, Jung made a number of attempts to define synchronicity, and here is probably one of the most accessible. A certain curious principle which takes the coincidence of events in space and time as meaning something more than mere chance. In his main essay on synchronicity, Jung gives an account of a young woman patient of his whose personal problems were linked with what he described as her rigid Cartesian conception of reality. She had had a dream in which she was given a golden scarab, and as she was describing her dream to Jung, there was a gentle tapping at the window. He looked out and saw a flying insect, which he grabbed and brought inside. It was a rose chafer, a species of scarab beetle, and the closest thing to a golden scarab to be found in that part of Europe. The coincidence of this, according to Jung, triggered a shift in the patient's conceptual rigidity, and then from then her condition began to improve. An added dimension to this story is that in ancient Egypt, the scarab was a symbol of rebirth, which appears to have been what took place psychologically for the young woman at that moment. So this is a book by David Peat, and Synchronicity, the Marriage of Matter and Psyche, and he has a scarab beetle on the cover. The image of the scarab beetle is now very much associated with Jung and synchronicity, and here's the cover. This is a fairly recent book on the subject. However, for Jung, synchronicity was much more than simply a synonym for meaningful coincidences. He also conceived of it as an acausal connecting principle for all types of phenomena that could not be fully explained by standard notions of causality, including quantum randomness and the results of ESP experiments. The Oxford Dictionary defines acausal as meaning not governed or operating by the laws of cause and effect, as with many elements of quantum physics. In terms of coincidences, there was obviously no causal connection between the woman's dream and the scarab beetle tapping at the window. Jung's purpose was to come up with a principle that could stand in contrast to what he described as the principle of causality. Now, Jung has not unreasonably been accused of having something of a billiard ball understanding of causality, what we might call the common sense notion of cause and effect. So you hit the ball there, it goes there. That's cause and effect in the very popular notion. This is something that philosophers have long debated about, especially since David Hume challenged the whole notion of causality in the 18th century. And Bertrand Russell, a century ago, said that the law of causality, like the monarchy, is a relic of a bygone era. Nevertheless, like the monarchy, our common sense notions of causality remain, and it is essentially these that Jung was referring to. So this is his book, Synchronicity and Acausal Connecting Principle. This essay is now published separately, but it originally came out in German in 1952 in a joint publication with the physicist Wolfgang Pauli. This is the English translation. The Interpretation of Nature and Psyche. The first essay was Synchronicity, and the second one was one by Pauli called The Influence of Archetypal Ideas on the Scientific Theories of Kepler. And in the essay on Kepler, this was the most fantastic quote that Pauli came up with, which I think really helped influence Jung, amongst other things. It would be most satisfactory of all if psyche and physis could be seen as complementary aspects of the same reality. Pauli actually helped Jung a lot with his thinking about synchronicity, and this statement gives a huge clue as to how Jung would end up explaining what synchronicity is and how it works. Here's a picture of Pauli with Werner Heisenberg in the 1950s. They were both founders of the whole quantum mechanics discovery of the 1920s and early 30s. There are a lot of interesting detours one could make here, but we'll go back to how Jung conceptualized the whole notion of synchronicity. An essential element of Jung's theory of synchronicity is the distinction he made between the wider principle of synchronicity, the acausal connecting principle of the subtitle of his treatise, and the narrower category of synchronistic events, which he described as a special instance of general acausal orderedness. Coming under the wider conception of synchronicity as acausal orderedness, properties of natural numbers, and in regard to the acausality of natural numbers, the physicist Eugene Wigner commented on the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics in the natural sciences. So the natural numbers, which actually Laurence has written about, they do have a property which just seems to be ad hoc. It can't be reduced. Another part of the wider conception, the discontinuities of quantum physics, measurement of radioactive decay, and ESP experiments. Coming under the narrower conception of synchronicity as a special instance, synchronistic events. So Jung separated synchronistic events from all these other things which did not have a causal explanation in his time or even in our time. So that we can see two types of synchronicity, which nowadays people think synchronicity, coincidence, and so, but actually it's much more involved than that. The main difference between the two categories is that in the wider category, while there is no currently satisfactory causal explanation for the phenomena, consistent results can be reproduced in experimental conditions, unlike the narrower category of synchronistic events, as these necessarily occur unpredictably and sporadically. Here's a very good example of one that I came across a few years ago. The story concerns a rabbi from Israel on a visit to New York. And now, the rabbi had a serious heart condition, and he was under the care of a local doctor in New York, whose telephone number he carried with him at all times. And this was before the days of mobile phones. One day, he started to feel severe heart pains, and so immediately called the number and asked if the doctor was there. And the person who answered the phone seemed a little puzzled, but said, yes, the doctor is there, and he would fetch him. The doctor came to the phone and assured the rabbi that he would be over soon. But before hanging up, he asked the rabbi how he knew his whereabouts, as he was on an emergency call and he had not told anyone where he was going. The rabbi, somewhat surprised, said, well, I just telephoned your usual number. And the doctor then looked down at the phone dial, and he saw that the number of the phone dial was exactly the same as his number, except one digit was out. So the rabbi had made an error on that one digit and got to the doctor. So later, after his arrival at the hospital, the rabbi was told that his life had been saved only by the timely intervention of the doctor. Now, this was obviously completely unpredictable and perhaps even unnecessary, one would assume, as he could have just as easily called an ambulance. But that's not what occurred. Instead, out of the blue, an exact mistake was made that was mathematically so unlikely in its precision and yet somehow so appropriate. There was also every likelihood that both the rabbi and the doctor were profoundly moved by their experience, which is very much a characteristic of synchronistic events, so, which I'll get onto a bit later. Okay, so here's some of the contemporary influences on Jung in the conceptualization of synchronicity. The contemporary meaning in his time, which is sort of the early part of the 20th century. There were some earlier influences on him, but I won't go into that now. So Paul Kammerer, I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was, I'll get on to him in a minute. Richard Wilhelm, who translated the I Ching that people are probably very familiar with. J.B. Rhine, of course, who was the parapsychology pioneer, and Pauli, who I've mentioned. Now, this is the enigmatic Paul Kammerer. He was an Austrian biologist and a Lamarckian who committed suicide after being accused, very possibly unfairly, of faking his evidence. You can read about this in Arthur Koestler's book, The Case of the Midwife Toad. Now, 100 years ago, there was huge controversies between the Darwinian theory of natural selection, which basically meant evolution through genetic mutation and the survival of the fittest, and the older idea arising from the French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, that species can develop characteristics during their lives. For example, strong legs for running, and these characteristics could be passed on to the next generation. So there was huge fighting. So the people who believed in natural selection, they thought if you build your muscle, you can't hand that on to the next generation. Lamarckians thought you could hand that on. And so there was, when these controversies occur, they can be absolutely vicious. And it was very vicious at that time. But in addition to being a Lamarckian, which was extremely unfashionable at the time, Kammerer was also extremely interested in coincidences. And his ideas on the subject were described by no less a figure than Einstein as original and by no means absurd. So Paul Kammerer, he was an Austrian biologist who for 20 years kept a logbook on coincidences, published in 1919 as Das Gesetz der Serie. For Kammerer, each coincidence we perceive is a fleeting glimpse or tip of the iceberg of the underlying activity of seriality, which he held to be ubiquitous and continuous in life, nature, and cosmos. It is the umbilical cord that connects thought, feeling, science, art with the womb of the universe which gave birth to them, which is quite a profound definition. He's a young man and he's totally on his own and just recording these things. Interestingly, Arthur Koestler was of the opinion that Jung was influenced by Kammerer more than he is prepared to admit, and speculates that had not Kammerer come up with the idea of seriality, Jung may not have come up with the idea of synchronicity. This may well be true, and I rather suspect it is. However, there are important differences between the two concepts. In seriality, there is an attractive force at play which expresses itself through the coming together of affinities, and such anecdotes are the bread and butter of all the amazing coincidence collections available out there. Here's one that I rather like. A golfer watched his perfect drive collide mid-flight with another ball, a recovery shot by another player in the opposite direction. Astounded by the coincidence, O'Brien and the other player ran to the collision point to introduce themselves. They were both called Kevin O'Brien. You get these books, I tell you, they're full of this stuff. But is it meaningful? And that's the difference between synchronicity and what we would call a random coincidence. This is indeed an amazing coincidence and a very good example of a notion of an attractive force at play. So possibly there's you could say that these guys were drawn together by some, that's quite a possible thing. So it isn't necessarily a synchronistic event, though a lot of popular books would certainly label it as such. I'll get on to exactly why in more detail a bit later, but it boils down to whether meaning was at the heart of the coincidence. It may have been synchronistic in this case, but not necessarily. Anyway, back to Kammerer. Jung was actually rather dismissive of Kammerer, and perhaps more so than he should have been. Indeed, it is a great pity that Kammerer took his own life, and one wonders how his ideas might have developed had he lived another 30 years. As an aside, it is actually due to the writings of Arthur Koestler that Kammerer was brought to public attention in the English-speaking world. And it's worth pointing out that probably the most influential writer on coincidences after Jung is Koestler, in particular his book, The Roots of Coincidence, which came out in 1972, which I have a copy of. And it's really quite a good cover, because you've got as above, so below. In the dominoes below is reflected in the stars. It's lovely. And I've had this book for years, and oh, that's what it is, right? So it took me about many years to really work that out. Okay, now, anybody recognize him? Just for interest. Okay, you probably use the I Ching. Anybody use the I Ching? Okay, so Richard Wilhelm, this is Richard Wilhelm, who translated the I Ching. And my argument is he's the most important influence on Jung. But I'll get into that in a minute. This is Richard Wilhelm, who perhaps had the most profound influence on Jung in regard to coincidences. Wilhelm went to China as a missionary in 1899 at the age of 26 and was based in Qingdao, which was controlled by Germany at the time. However, he never made a single conversion, and he was apparently very proud of this. Instead, he set about learning Chinese and went on to translate the Tao Te Ching. In 1911, Wilhelm had the good fortune to meet and subsequently collaborate with Lao Nai Swan, a traditional scholar with considerable understanding of the I Ching. Now, this picture is taken from a Japanese Wikipedia site, so I don't know if it's accurate or they just took some peasant. But but he has a beard, so it could be accurate. But I'm trying to find pictures of this guy on the internet, and I couldn't. Anyway, let's assume it's an archetype of the possibility that is the guy. Okay, their method of collaboration is worth mentioning. It required first a detailed discussion of the meaning of the text. Then Wilhelm translated it into German and then back into Chinese. And only when the full meaning emerged would they consider the translation complete. So Wilhelm translated it into German, and then he had to translate it back into Chinese, which is very tough. I mean, you think that World War I proved to be a serious interruption, and Lao had to leave Qingdao, where Wilhelm was in charge of the Chinese Red Cross. But he eventually returned, to Wilhelm's great joy, and they were able to finish the translation. Of this last phase, Wilhelm wrote, "Those were rare hours of inspiration I spent with my aged master. When the work in its essential features was almost finished, fate called me back to Germany. In the meantime, my venerable master departed this world." Wilhelm's translation of the I Ching was published in Germany in the early 20s. After his return, this one says 1924. Very interestingly, the English version did not actually come out until 1951. So this hardly sold. But when the English one came out, bam. Very, very interesting, because it shows a sort of people thinking differently later on. Also in the early 20s, Wilhelm met Jung, who was already familiar with I Ching and had been experimenting with it, albeit by an inferior translation. For Jung, coming across Wilhelm's translation was nothing short of a revelation, and meeting Wilhelm was for him profoundly significant. Concerning this encounter, he wrote, "He as a sinologue and I as a physician would probably never have come into contact had we remained specialists. But we met in a field of humanity which begins beyond academic boundary posts. There lay our point of contact. There leaped across the spark of light that kindled the light destined to become one of the most meaningful events of my life. Because of this experience, I may speak of Wilhelm and his work, thinking with grateful reverence of this mind which created a bridge between East and West and gave to the Occident the precious heritage of a culture thousands of years old, a culture perhaps destined to disappear." And this is before communism. And another quote, "Anyone who, like myself, has had the rare good fortune to experience this, in a spiritual exchange with Wilhelm, the divinatory power of the I Ching, cannot for long remain ignorant of the fact that we have touched here an Archimedean point from which our Western attitude of mind could be shaken to its foundations." What was particularly brought to life to Jung and others who had access to Wilhelm's translation was the whole idea of the Tao itself. No longer simply an interesting and perhaps useful philosophical notion, the Tao could, via the I Ching, be intuited directly as the connecting principle between the objective physical world and the subjective psychological world. Jung saw the I Ching as a way of generating an experience of the Tao and considered Wilhelm's achievement to be of the utmost significance. He has transmitted to us the living germ of the Chinese spirit, capable of working an essential change in our view of life. This is the English version. Actually, my first introduction to the concept of synchronicity came via Jung's foreword, 1949 foreword to this translation of the I Ching, which the foreword is, by the way, freely available on the internet. I got a book list here if anybody's interested. A lot of the stuff there is available on the internet. And it's probably the most well-known of all Jung's writings. We talk about Jung, but probably his introduction to the I Ching is his most well-known. It's also a lot more accessible in terms of an introduction to synchronicity than his main essay, which does unfortunately take a lot of unpacking. Indeed, we might speak of an earlier and later Jung in relation to the conceptualization of synchronicity. The earlier we could describe as a simpler, more Chinese approach, and the later much more involved with quantum physics and ESP. So we come to J.B. Rhine, whose initials incidentally stand for Joseph Banks Rhine, and who, like his namesake, was initially a botanist. He became famous during the 1930s for his attempts to establish a scientific basis for parapsychology. In 1934, Rhine sent Jung a complimentary copy of his book, Extrasensory Perception, on the assumption that he might be interested in his research. And in the following year, Rhine established the Duke Parapsychology Laboratory. In 1940, after reviewing his third book, Extrasensory Perception, after 60 years, Jung wrote the following to Rhine. "It is a most interesting and valuable piece of work you have produced for your collaboration. I'm glad that somebody has undertaken the enormously patient work to produce an unshakable basis for ESP. For Jung, verifiable evidence of parapsychology was not only of great importance to himself personally, but also for his attempt to establish a scientific footing for his theory of synchronicity." Indeed, in 1951, not long before the publication of his main essay, he wrote the following to Rhine. "I regretted very much not seeing you when you were in Europe. Very soon after you left, I recovered from my illness and have been able to finish a paper that is largely based on your ESP experiment, which, by the way, is intensely discussed over here by psychologists as well as physicists. If that's true, it means that people in those days took parapsychology a hell of a lot more seriously than they do now. In fact, if you look at the heads of the Parapsychic Society in London, the Society for Psychical Research in London, the heads 100 years ago were very, very eminent scientists. Nowadays, very interesting what's happened in the scientific community. Anyway, the key point here is that Jung says that his synchronicity essay is largely based on Rhine's work. This comes as something of a surprise to anyone who reads it, though Jung certainly uses Rhine's findings to support its wider concept of synchronicity as an acausal connecting principle. Rhine himself, however, and probably rightly, wasn't convinced of this and was very much in favor of a causal explanation in support of the reality of ESP. Okay, and there's an article by, which is on the list there, by Victor Mansfield, James Hall, and Sally Rhine Feather, which talks about this. Sally Rhine Feather is J.B. Rhine's daughter and is still operating. Okay, now we're going to move to Pauli, and this is actually a quote by Einstein, who in a talk, "Nobody is smarter than Einstein." Wrong, you have Wolfgang Pauli. He's supposed to have said that. So this is actually a quote by Einstein, who in a talk in 1946 referred to Pauli as his spiritual son. Pauli was indeed extremely smart and a Nobel Prize winner, and it would have been a big coup for Jung to have a physicist of Pauli's caliber to support him and his theory of synchronicity. So this is Pauli. The correspondence between Jung and Pauli has been published and provides a fascinating glimpse into how they interacted. It's worth pointing out that Jung was 25 years Pauli's senior and had helped him psychologically through a very stressful period during the 1930s. And naturally, Pauli was very polite in his letters to him. Nevertheless, he was not afraid of upbraiding him when he felt that his thinking was sloppy. For example, he told Jung that he thought Rhine's experiments were involved with a totally different phenomenon to synchronicity in the original sense of meaningful coincidence. And he had this to say when Jung tried to bring meaning into quantum physics. Although microphysics allows for an acausal form of observation, it actually has no use for the concept of meaning. So I have grave misgivings about placing physical discontinuities and synchronicity on the same level, which is what you do on page 58. If you do not share my misgivings, I shall be most interested to hear what your arguments are. Jung certainly took this on board and made a number of changes to his manuscript as a result of Pauli's criticism, including this particular one. Unlike Jung, Pauli was terminologically very precise. For example, he thought that the word synchronicity was misleading because its root word synchron means the same time, as in synchronize. So synchron. Nowadays you hear the word synchronicity used for synchronization all the time. Pauli preferred the term meaning correspondence, but Jung was not about to let go of a concept that he'd been nurturing for 2 decades. However, to clarify matters, at the end of the English translation of his essay, Jung wrote, "Despite my express warning, I see that this concept has been confused with synchronism. By synchronicity, I mean the occurrence of a meaningful coincidence in time. The psychic and physical aspects of a meaningful coincidence may be simultaneous or they may be chronologically separate." One of the major criticisms of Jung's whole notion of synchronicity is that he claimed that meaningful coincidences occurred more than should happen naturally by chance. And for this, which is in his essay, he has been taken to task by statisticians and probability theorists. For example, the mathematician Stephen Strogatz writes that no evidence has ever been found for Carl Jung's idea of synchronicity, the claim that meaningful coincidence in our lives occur more than by chance alone. So it's interesting, because Jung said this occurs more than by chance, people could attack that, but they didn't. So they say, well, if that's not true, then the whole thing's not true. This is their way of operating. After making that assertion in his very interesting book, Sync, Strogatz goes on to give an account of a meaningful coincidence in his own life that got him onto the area of research that ended up his writing his book. So it's not the occurrence of meaningful coincidences per se that he is questioning, but rather the suggestion that they occur more often than chance would allow. The fact is that if you study probability theory, then chance allows for all sorts of incredible things to occur. For example, this rather amazing photo. Okay, assuming that this is genuine, not the result of photoshopping, and nowadays we think photoshopping, but just say that it's genuine. Let's assume for a moment that it really is genuine, and let us also assume that the photographer had no idea about it until he or she saw the result. Now, is it a meaningful coincidence?
Just lucky.
Just lucky? Could it be meaningful?
Depends on who's seeing it, whether it's meaningful for that person.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. So the meaning, actually, the way Jung describes it, the meaning is prior to the analysis. It's instantly meaningful, if it is meaningful. It's certainly what we might call a wow factor coincidence, which are a dime a dozen in all the amazing coincidence books, but is it intrinsically meaningful? Personally, I don't think so, despite the smile. And I don't think there is such a thing as a coincidence that is necessarily meaningful. It all boils down to whether, and this is completely in line with Jung's writing on the topic, there's an equivalence of meaning between the subjective and the objective aspects of the coincidence. In the photo, there is the coincidence of birds flying in that particular shape, but whether or not there's a meaning correspondence with the person experiencing it is quite another matter. This is well expressed in the following quote by the psychologist David Richer. "Chance and synchronicity will look the same in their display of an event, but they are worlds apart. Chance happens to us, synchronicity happens in us. And I think that's a very beautiful quote, actually. Yeah. Now, I'll present an example of my own experience that seems to qualify. It took place while I was doing the research for my doctorate. I was flying back from Sydney to Brisbane at New Year. This is a few years back. And I was listening to an iPod and to an iPod talk. And the person talking was talking about frozen emotions. And he said, people who have frozen emotions, it's like frostbite. You don't know, you can't feel, when you have frostbite, you can't feel, you don't know you've got frostbite until your limbs start to thaw. And when your hands or feet start to thaw, the feeling is very terrible. And in the same way, people with frozen emotions, they don't know they have frozen emotions until they start to thaw. And I thought, well, that's very interesting, but it doesn't refer to me. I remember thinking that. And then on the tray table of the lady sitting next to me was a novel. And the name of the novel was Frostbite. And I thought, thank you. And, actually, yeah, it's very interesting because it was like, it wasn't a big coincidence, but it was like, oh yes, it does refer to you. And that's all that's needed. And, that's. So what makes a synchronicity? From reading of Jung and the surrounding literature, there seem to be three key elements that are crucial to the second meaning of the subject of this talk, which is the composition of synchronicity. And these are the three elements. In his essay, Jung identifies three key elements that characterize a synchronistic occurrence. One, an equivalence of meaning between an external event and deep psychological processes in the individual involved. So for me, at that second, seeing the word frostbite out there, it went bam. And there was a equivalence of meaning in a split second before I could analyze it. Second, an accompanying feeling of numinosity experienced as an emotional charge. And third, a flash of total insight, or as Jung called it, absolute knowledge. Suddenly you just know in that second. So it's not just, oh, he made it up afterwards. So in the frostbite situation, the meaning equivalence occurred when I saw the title of the book. And along with the meaning equivalence, there was the same instant, both a sudden emotional charge of awe and wonder, an intake of the breath, as it were, and a flash of clarity that my emotions were indeed frozen, and that the frostbite insight was something I couldn't just wave aside. So here's a quote from Marie-Louise von France, who in terms of exploring and writing about synchronicity was very much Jung's successor. So she says, the realization of meaning is not a simple acquisition of information or of knowledge, but a living experience that touches the heart just as much as the mind. It seems to us to be an illumination characterized by great clarity as well as something ineffable. So touching the heart is very lovely because it's like, oh. And so to me, that's what makes it. Here is a photo of von France in later life. And I'd like to read a brief excerpt from a lecture she gave in 1969 as part of a series on the subject of divination and synchronicity. In his paper on synchronicity, Jung stresses the point that since the physical and psychic realms coincide within the synchronistic event, there must be somewhere or somehow a Unitarian reality, one reality of the physical and psychic realms, to which he gives the Latin expression unus mundus, the one world, a concept which already existed in the minds of some medieval philosophers. The world, Jung says, we cannot visualize. This world, Jung says, we cannot visualize, and it completely transcends our conscious grasps. We can only conclude or assume that there is somewhere such a reality, a psychophysical reality, we should call it, which sporadically manifests in the synchronistic event. Here's another quote. The most essential and certainly the most impressive thing about synchronistic occurrences, the thing which really constitutes their numinosity, is the fact that in them the duality of soul and matter seems to be eliminated. They are therefore an empirical indication of an ultimate unity of all existence, which Jung, using the terminology of medieval natural philosophy, called the unus mundus. Jung also thought that synchronicities were empirical indications of the existence of the unus mundus. Though this use of the word empirical, it should be emphasized, does not refer to formal scientific testing, but rather to the traditional meaning of observation and experience. Here we have the color version of the now quite famous 19th century illustration, generally known as the Flammarion woodcut. It has appeared all over the place to represent all sorts of disciplines and searches of new horizons. We can see some interwoven cosmic wheels on the top left of the picture. These apparently represent the vision of Ezekiel in the Bible. The wheels are interlocking and cannot function. They are in the form of a double mandala and designate, according to von Franz, a coming together of time and the timeless. Von Franz uses the illustration in her book Number and Time to explain symbolically the workings of synchronicity. And here's what she has to say. In the picture, the spiritual pilgrim leaves ordinary space-time behind and gazes through the window of eternity into the world of timeless order. In this way, he escapes the stifling clutches of a one-sided view of life. Through this window, also called the window of escape and the window of enlightenment, man touches the eternal in himself, and at the same time the eternal can reach into his time-bound world in the form of synchronistic events. The double wheel representing here Ezekiel's vision should be noted. The wheels do not work in unison, but are contiguous at the center, which is a technical impossibility. The two systems are incommensurable. The mysterious point of contact between the two systems appears to be at the center or a sort of pivot where psyche and matter meet. When an individual enters into relation with the forces of the pivot, he finds himself close to the source of miracles, which seemingly could not occur without a corresponding attitude on his part. When such a constellation exists and eternity breaks through momentarily into our temporal system, the primal unity actively manifests itself and temporarily unites the double structures into one, so to speak. This is how the unus mundus becomes revealed in the phenomenon of synchronicity. But immediately afterward, the flow of events resumes its course on the track of the ordinary temporal pattern, and the timeless order falls back into the latent condition once more. So the pilgrim can't keep his head out there. He has to come back in. Okay, this is a quote from Jung. The difference between most people and myself is that for me, the dividing walls are transparent. So he was getting little indications all the time from life. Very interesting. This is an interesting quote, especially when related to the previous slide. Like the peoples of the ancient world, Jung was sensitive to what the classical historian Robin Lane Fox described as the rustling universe, the continual ebb and flow of the forces of nature, as well as the movements and moods of those he encountered, were for Jung potential mirrors for what was going on within his psyche. In other words, particularly in his latter years, when he was able to spend more time at his country retreat in Bollingen, on the shores of Lake Zurich, Jung came to inhabit a synchronistic reality where the external and the internal were in continual reflection of one another. As Jung himself put it, sometimes I feel as if I'm spread over the landscape and inside things, and am myself living in every tree, in the splashing of the waves, in the clouds and the processions of the seasons. At Bollingen there was no external source of water or power, and Jung was able to live, as he described it, like a peasant. He continues, I have done without electricity and tend the fireplace and stove myself. Evenings, I light the old lamps. There is no running water or electricity, and I pump the water from the well. I chop the wood and cook the food. These simple acts make man simple, and how difficult it is to be simple. And here's a picture of Jung drawing water at Bollingen. And that's the end.